Karibuni, welcome to those who are going to be joining us today for this reading. We just there we go. Forgot my greetings. So welcome, Karibuni, asante kwa kuwa nasi. Today we celebrate Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. Today is her birthday, September 26th. And in honor of her and in memory of her, we will be reading her epilogue on 491 Days. We showed this during the weekend when we spoke of her. And this is thanks to Ohio University Press and Pan Macmillan South Africa, who gave us the permissions today to read this to our community. Mama Winnie will say, you will see as we read the epilogue, meant for this to reach you all, because she has messages for you in here and concerns that she hopes do not come true. So we're going to be reading this and sharing with you all so that we can get the word out. Okay. Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, Epilogue. When the pages that make up this journal were returned to me after so many years, I did not want to read them. I was afraid. There are memories you keep in a part of your brain. It is part of those things that hurt so much that you do not want to remember. Getting it back after more than 40 years probed that particular part of the brain that had stored it. I never thought I wanted to revisit those times. But at the same time, I was glad that one could have a glimpse, a little peek through that window of darkness, and relive those times for the sake of posterity. To be able to tell our children and grandchildren what we went through. I was fearful to go through that again. Afraid of hurting myself and hurting my children, because in hindsight, you cannot help but think, what did I do to my children? That is the truth. That was the physical experience. That was why I was so scared to revisit that period, because seeing those pages of handwritten notes and diaries brought back that fateful day. My children, Zinzi and Zeni, were clinging to my skirt crying, Mommy, Mommy, don't go. It was about 2:30 or 3 a.m., and they were used to these knocks. The authorities would knock at the door, knock at the windows, kick the doors in, and break the windows. But that day I knew I was going for a long period of time. So I went into prison against that background, and I did not know whether the children would survive. I did not know where they were going to take them to because the police who arrested me never even asked where they should take them. It was God's luck that at that age, they remembered my elder sister's name. Zeni was 10 years old and Zinzi was 8. I learned after a month that they were actually with my elder sister. I already had a bag. I always had this bag packed because the children were too young to bring me clothes in prison, and I had been arrested so often. I was not permitted to have an adult at home because I was under house arrest, and speaking to me was tantamount to having leprosy. You are infecting yourself because you were bound to be arrested. So I ended up not communicating with people, trying to protect them. This even applied to my own family. I could not even take the children to my sister. I did not know what my fate would be because we were part of an experiment, the first ever to be detained under Section 6 of the then Terrorism Act. They were using me as a barometer, a political barometer. If they could arrest this number one terrorist and number one terrorist's wife, then they could measure the political heat in the country and how the country was going to react. After Madiba's arrest, he was in prison for life, and I was this communist who was continuing where others had left off. So arresting me was the highest point in their lives. They knew they had completely thwarted opposition to their nationalist government policies. I was aware that I was being used as a barometer to test the reaction of the country. If they could take if they could take his wife, when there was so much noise when he was arrested and jailed for life, what did the nationalists have to worry about thereafter? They were going to just sit back and rest and rule forever. So I was arrested in that atmosphere, and I knew my fate was in those people's hands, and I knew no one would have the courage to open their mouth because apartheid meant murder in those days. If you dared oppose the nationalists, you were dead. Once this lawyer came to me at midnight to find out how I could help him leave the country. I was doing a lot of that in those days. The security branch happened to get this information, and they detained him in John Vorster Square. The following day, he was dead. That is how vicious apartheid was then. Our lives were nothing. When we arrived at Pretoria Central Prison, we were all held in a certain section of the prison. Then I was removed and placed on death row, in that cell with 3 doors, the grill door, then the actual prison door, and then another grill door. The sound of that key when they opened the first door, the first grill door, was done in such a way that your heart missed a beat, and it was such a shock. You had been all by yourself with dead silence for hours and hours and hours, and suddenly there would be this. That alone drove you berserk. That alone meant to emphasize the fact that we are in control, not only of your being, but your soul as well as we can destroy it. Solitary confinement is worse than hard labor. When you do hard labor, you are with other prisoners. You can tolerate it because you all dig together. You communicate and you are alive. Solitary confinement is meant to kill you alive. It is the most vicious punishment that you could wish on your worst enemy. You are imprisoned in this little cell. When you stretch your hands, you touch the walls. You are reduced to a nobody, a non-value. It is like killing you alive. You are alive because you breathe. You are deprived of everything, your dignity, your everything. We were held incommunicado. We were not allowed to even see a lawyer. In those days, we were completely at their mercy. Some families never knew their loved ones died after they were detained. We were lucky to be alive, and it was purely because of my name that I survived, because the easiest thing for them at the time would have been to kill me, which they threatened every day. "Oh, you're still alive?" They would come in every day and say, "You're still alive? We don't know if you would be alive tomorrow." They honestly believed that it was impossible for a Black woman to have this kind of stamina, to be this stubborn, because they were meant to break us, and they could not believe that anyone would resist them like that. When we were released the first time, I had red lips from pellagra, and my skin was peeling because even when you tried to eat, you brought up because you were very, very hungry. We were supposed to be awaiting trial prisoners, but they did not treat us as such. Our lawyers had to make an application to the Supreme Court for us to be brought food, and then when they brought this food, it was bread, they would break the bread. If it was bread, they would break the bread. They were searching to see if there was anything hidden in it. They would break the fruit open, so you got your food in pieces, just to humiliate you and to show you you are a nobody. They reduced you to such levels. They still searched you in your cell despite the fact that you had nothing other than the clothes you were wearing, 2 blankets and a mat. We had a plastic bottle with 2.5 liters of water for the whole day. That was your ration for the day, and you drank from the bottle. There was no glass, you drank from that. Then you wiped your face with that, and you just wiped your armpits and yourself. One of our lawyers, George Bezos, had to apply for us to wash. An application had to be brought before the Supreme Court for months to allow us to wash properly. Solitary confinement was designed to kill you so slowly that you were long dead before you died. By the time you died, you were nobody. You had no soul anymore, and a body without a soul is a corpse anyway. It is unbelievable that you survived all that. When I was told that most of my torturers were dead, I was so heartbroken. I wanted them to see the dawn of freedom. I wanted them to see how they lost their battle with all that they did to us that made this history. We are the survivors who made this history. When I was in detention for all those months, my two children nearly died. When I came out, they were so lean they had such a hard time. They were covered in sores, malnutrition sores, and they wonder why I am like I am. And they have a nerve to say, "Oh, Madiba is such a peaceful person, you know." We wonder how he had such a wife who is so violent. The leadership on Robben Island was never touched. The leadership on Robben Island had no idea what it was like to engage the enemy physically. The leadership was removed and cushioned behind prison walls. They had their meals a day. They had their 3 meals a day. In fact, ironically, we must thank the authorities for keeping our leadership alive. They were not tortured. They did not know what we were talking about and when we were reported to be so violent, engaged and when we were reported to be so violent, engaged in the physical struggle, fighting the Boers underground, they did not understand because none of them had ever been subjected to that, not even Madiba himself. They never touched him. They would not have dared. We were the foot soldiers. We were their cannon fodder, and it was us who were used as their political barometer each time they wanted to find out how the country was going to react. They tortured us knowing that it was going to leak to the country, and they wanted to test the reaction. Tata could not comprehend how I had become so violent in the eyes of the police. They knew that I was involved with the military wing of the ANC, and they knew I was a leader of the struggle underground. They knew I saved soldiers who infiltrated into the country. But we learned all kinds of tricks to protect ourselves against them. I learned then that the nearer the danger, the safer the place, which is the first thing they are taught in the military. It was him, Tata, who always repeated that the nearer the danger, the safer the place. So I hid the cadres next to the police station. Not one of those cadres was arrested, and they were right under their noses. If I had a very dangerous unit, which was in the high command and involved in special operations, I hid them around the police station. And they could not catch me because I discovered that the only way to survive those days was to operate alone. There was always a danger of getting someone killed by merely associating with them. That is why I never knew their real names. I never knew the names of the units that infiltrated the country. When they came into the country, I gave them my own combat names so that they did not coincide with the names they used in the camps, and they would not know who was who. These are people who are generals in South Africa Army today, who hold the highest offices in government, but they must tell their stories themselves. We and the enemy hunted each other at sunset. Our daybreak was 6 p.m. We operated right through the night. It did not matter where I was. Daybreak was nightfall. We reversed the hours in the same way we had to reverse the values of society. Zinzi and Zeni would ask questions, especially Zinzi. She was a very troublesome child. She had a very inquiring mind. Her sister did it in a more somber and dignified way. Zeni was always the princess. She was born like that. When her father used to play with her as a baby, he addressed her as princess. That is how she became HRH. And she is still HRH today. That is how we addressed her. Zinzi was a tomboy and she was always asking, "Ma, you know? You know you're a liar." "Why, darling?" I always give the example of Tatu Sibeko, my next door neighbor, a Zulu from Zululand and one of those real traditional types. And so Zinzi came in. She was about 5 or 6, and she said, "Mommy, you said all the daddies are in jail. Why are the daddies in jail?" I said, Because they are fighting for us to also be able to live in town. You could not use the word free because the children did not understand. They want us to have nice houses and also live next to the shops in town. And then she said, but then why is Tatu Sibeko next door at home? Why hasn't he gone to fight for that? And then she went on to say, but mommy, the other children say people who are in prison are bad people. What do you say? This is a 6-year-old with an inquiring mind. Both of them would confront me with these questions, so the values of society were reversed to the extent that as they grew older, the fathers who were not in jail were collaborators. It was wrong not to be in jail. You were a collaborator. It was right to be in prison. It was not that if you steal, you would be arrested and you would go to jail. You could not use that example, so we had to use religious examples and say, you know, if you do wrong things, your angel is watching. You know God does not want you to do bad things. That's why we have to pray. That's why we have the Lord's Prayer. You mustn't do bad things. We could not use imprisonment for right and wrong because then they would have regarded their father as a criminal. And how would you get that out of a child's mind? No matter how she gets educated later on in life, what you teach the child as a mother in the formative years is what sticks. There was propaganda from the nationalists that their father was a terrorist. He was a killer. And how do you change those values later on in life? People do not realize how tough it was to bring up children in those years. They have led conflicted lives and they have turned out to be who they are. You do not know how many times parents like us fell on our knees and thanked God that they turned out to be who they are. It was touch and go. The child could have turned out to be a criminal. In fact, the child could have grown up to blame you. When they discovered the truth, they could have told us, how dare you? So mommy and daddy gave us up and chose the world and chose the country, chose to fight for the people, these people? Can you imagine what that would have meant to our families if they had turned out to have such questioning minds? At what point do you, as a parent, decide that you would fight for a cause that is thankless sometimes, but you know you are fighting for human dignity? When Tata was arrested in 1962, I got my first banning order. It had no name. Mandela's wife was banned and confined, and the rest of the world did not know who I was. I could never say anything that was from myself, my own mind. It was possible they did that deliberately, but my reaction was that if you have arrested the man, you must destroy what he left behind. I took that as a direct attack on women and that we were useless. Our husbands were our voices, and in their absence, the struggle would end. To the prisoners, if they did not have the support of their families, that would have been their end. I realized how important the support of family is when you are in prison. When Tata was arrested on 5th August 1962, I decided I will fight them to the last drop of my blood. I'm going to fight them and I'm not going to let them break me. I will never let them break me. I was aware of the fact that suddenly I discovered, oh, I have no name now. Everything I did as Mandela's wife. I lost my individuality. Mandela's wife said this, Mandela's wife was arrested. It did not matter who the hell I was. It did not matter that I was a Madikizela. It did not matter that I was a human being. And it was understandable to the oppressor that whatever they did to Mandela's wife, she deserved it. So I thought, my goodness, I've grown up a princess in my own home. I come from the royal house of Pondoland, and suddenly I've lost my identity because of this struggle. I'm going to fix them. I will fight them and I will establish my own identity. I deliberately did that. I said I was not going to bask in his shadow and be known as Mandela's wife. They were going to know me as Zanyiwe Madikizela. I fought for that. I said, I will not even bask in his politics. I'm going to form my own identity because I never did bask in his ideas. I had my own mind. I realized that, my goodness, if you are married, you lose your identity completely. I became a nobody. I had grown up walking tall in my home. I had been taught by my mother and my father that I must walk tall. I am me. I am black. I must be proud of my blackness. My father taught me the history of our country. He taught me about the 9 Kosa Wars. He taught me the role of the role the Pondos played in the liberation struggle. He taught me what happened when the 1820 settlers came into the country and how Van Riebeck landed in the Cape in 1652. I heard all this history from my father, and then I came here. I am a nobody. Not on your life. No, I'm going to be who my father taught me to be. I'm going to walk tall. My grandmother, my father's mother, was one of the 29 wives of my great grandfather, who was a chief. My grandmother was the first woman to wear shoes in Pondoland in those days, and when she bragged about these shoes, it turned out that they were sneakers. But she was the first of the chief's wives to wear shoes, and she hated the people who came with silky hair, blue eyes, and with those light skins. She hated them because she had been a shopkeeper. She was the first of the chief's wives to have one of those stalls in the rural areas. I do not remember how now what they used to call them, what they used to be called. But she was the first to own a shop, and when these people came, she lost that shop. She lost that land. She hated them. My mother was light skinned, very light skinned, and as a result, we were not our grandmother's favorites because most of our sisters had the same skin as my mother. My grandmother was very, very anti white. So you can imagine me having this grandmother with my father teaching me this history, and I grew up learning that we must walk tall. That is in fact that in fact Africa is ours, and Africa was stolen from us by these people who came and took our grandfather's land. There were these two backgrounds, and then I came to Johannesburg. I was a young social worker. I got married to this man, and here I was taken back again to my grandmother's days when she taught me to walk tall. So when the authorities banished me to Brantford, and as far as they were concerned, that was just the last act to bury me forever. But I was never as active as I was in Brantford. I presented a public picture that I was in banishment and international community, and the international community was singing our name all over the world. I recruited from the Free State like you have never known. The apartheid system formed the homelands, and each homeland had its own pseudo passport called Inkwadana Yoku Ndwendwela, small book of visiting. The travel documents were not recognized by any other country in the world, not even by the protectorate sister states. So the people would travel to these bordering countries and leave this so-called travel document at the border, and they had an arrangement with the homeland governments that the people would be allowed to go to those countries, and when they returned to South Africa, then they would pick these documents up. Every week I had soccer teams from Bradford going to play in Botswana and Lesotho. Bradford was close to both Lesotho and Botswana. They left those travel documents at the borders and they never came back. The authorities were so stupid not to realize that they were not coming back into the country. They were so keen to have these pseudo-traveling documents recognized that it never occurred to them that there must have been bags full of these travel documents at the borders. I recruited more people from Bradford than I had ever done in Soweto. Because I was under house arrest in Bradford, I had to sign in at 6 p.m. every day, especially over weekends. I would sign in at 6 p.m. and then get back to the house, change, dress like an auntie who was selling apples, and get into the car, a different car. I sometimes went to Soweto. I recruited right through the night in Soweto from Bradford. At about 5 a.m., I was back on my bed, sleeping, and they always came to check at around 5:30 a.m. By 6 a.m., they were in front of the house to see if I was going to get up, and I would go out. The toilets were outside, and yawn and stretch myself. I would act as if I had been sleeping. Meanwhile, I had been in Soweto the whole night. They taught us to do things like that. We really became criminals. I ask the question there, what are oppressive laws to the oppressed? Who really is a criminal when you're talking about oppressor and oppressed? It was a thankless job. You were not fighting to gain anything personally. At least those of us who were not aspiring to positions in government and to enrich ourselves. Those of us who were so young in the struggle were hooked. It was like opium. Fighting for freedom in the ANC was the greatest thing in your life. You knew there could have been in you knew there could not have been any greater reward than the freedom of your people. We did not know it was a thankless job and people were fighting to be presidents. And I will also say there, it is thankless. I'm going to do the commentary at the end. Let me just mark these areas. I would do it all over again. I realized that that is what a liberation movement is all about, actually. That is why it is called a struggle. Those who were fighting for their own positions and things were really fighting differently from us. You accept the fact that there will always be the Oliver Tambos, the Chris Hannis, the Nelson Mandelas, and the Sisulus of the day. My personal mentor was always Tatu Walter Sisulu, whom I grew up worshipping as a young bride because he was like a father to Tata and Tata revered him. When I was newly married, Tatu Sisulu sold watches and jewelry. Excuse me. He was so humble. We would go and pick him up every day. He lived in an ordinary house in the township, and we hardly realized that would ultimately happen to those people. What would ultimately happen to those people? We never had dreams of them being in government and being presidents, and that is why up to this day, Tatu Sisulu never wanted any position in government. He refused and even turned down positions with the ANC. He was the type of person, unassuming, fighting for the liberation of this country, of his country. The liberation of your fellow man was the greatest reward, and that is how Tatu Walter used to walk, and that is how Chief Albert Luthuli was, and I was so blessed to know all of them. I used to cook for them, these big men. I only realized their stature long thereafter. I just worshipped them as my leaders. I used to cook for J.B. Marks and Moses Kotane in that little house in Orlando. I even used to cook for Gacha Buthelezi when he would come with the king of the Zulus and they would have dialogues with Tata through the night. At that time, they were starting to form Inkatha, which was originally a structure that was meant to be used in the light of the Youth League. Buthelezi was going to use Inkatha to fight apartheid from within. That is why originally the colors of Inkatha were the colors of the ANC. He was one of the greatest fighters in his day, and he was entrusted with Matanzima, with fighting the system from within. And that is what people do not know. Looking back as a parent, you feel you do not deserve this forgiveness because you cannot explain yourself to the children, and you fear that you would never understand or they would never understand. You are lucky that they understand so much anyway, that they do not begrudge you. And what makes things difficult, of course, is when they see that what is happening today to other people is all about enrichment and it was never about self-sacrifice. They cannot even understand why I live in Soweto, really. They do not understand that it was a statement on my part. I made a conscious decision that I was going to live in Soweto instead of moving to the suburbs. I fought for my children to lead the kind of normal life they could live anywhere, but I will die in Soweto. The only time I am in the suburbs is when I'm in the hospital. I felt strongly that this journey and these letters needed to be published in this way, exactly as they were written at the time, so that my children and my grandchildren and whoever else reads them should please see to it that the country never ever degenerates to levels such as those. It is for their future. Right now, people like myself who come from that era become petrified when we see us sliding, becoming more and more like our oppressive masters. To me, That is exactly what is happening, and that is what scares me. Throughout the years of oppression, I think my feelings got blunted because you were so tortured that the pain reached a threshold where you could not feel pain anymore. If you keep pounding and pounding on the same spot, the feeling dies, the nerves die. I can feel us sliding back to that right now. I'm going to say it will be very unfortunate. And I do agree with Mama Winnie that we are doing our very best to become more and more like our oppressive masters. Um, I am not going to call them masters. I'm going to say we're doing more and more. We're becoming more and more like our oppressors. You see Black people just working very hard to be more and more like our oppressors, more and more like this idea of excellence, which is our oppressors, but it's called excellence, right? And success. But it's them, more and more like the capitalists. And Mama Winnie is saying she's fearful of that. She's fearful that that means we are going backwards, we as Africans. Instead of walking forwards towards our liberation, we're moving backwards into an even worse oppressive state. As far as her saying that the oppressors taught them to do things like that, they really became criminals. They only become criminals because the law that is being held against them is written by the oppressor against the oppressed. So any rising up against the oppressor, any action on the part of the oppressed to take down the oppressor and end their oppression is going to be considered criminal. And therefore, I ask of us, African people, how long are we going to go along with the oppressors' tactics of naming our revolutionaries criminals? How long will we stand by, be quiet, afraid of being judged for supporting them, our revolutionaries who stand up for us, who are brave enough to stand up for us despite all the harm that is brought their way, despite the imprisonment, the solitary confinement. And she explains how horrible that was. Despite all the trauma, they still get up. She talks about, Mama Winnie talks about in the book, and you can all buy it. It has, this is a book, a compilation of her journal entries while she was in prison, and it has letters between she and Madiba throughout that time, and others as well. Excuse me. So it just gives you insight on what she was going through and what she had to go through for our sake. And it may seem, and at the moment to her, it seemed, although she was a Pan-African, she was an African internationalist, she saw the liberation of Africans beyond the borders, that this was only a fight for South Africa. But no, she was for women, she was for Africans all over the globe and their freedom. And for us to show our thanks, for us to honor her, we must make sure that we're not going back. We're not doing our best to become more and more like our oppressors, because that is definitely going to take us away from our liberation. She says she did not know at the moment, while going through the struggle for the liberation of Africans, she did not know that it was a thankless job. And it is unfortunate for me to admit that it is still a thankless job to this day. You have Black people who will criticize you for being revolutionary, for wanting change, for wanting liberation of African people, instead of joining you or supporting you if they don't want to join you on the front lines, right? They're thankless, despite the fact that when we do actually get liberated, they will be benefiting. When we do get liberated, we don't have to worry about a shooting of a Black person probably happens within hours every day. That is liberation for them as well. And they're thankless. And unfortunately, that is still true to this day. There was somewhere else I had marked. She says, God does not want you to do bad things to the children. That's why we have to pray. That's why we have the Lord's Prayer. You mustn't do bad things. We could not use imprisonment for right and wrong, because they then would have regarded their father as a criminal. And how would you get that out of a child's mind? That goes back to what I was saying again about revolutionaries being criminalized when all they are doing is wanting a better life for Africans. And the struggle of being a mother or a father, a parent in this work, how to explain to your children in a society where they're told that when people are sent to prison, they're criminals, that when your people are sent to prison, they're not criminals. Like the mixed messages, you have to be completely on top of your game, and you have to prepare your kids mentally to be on top of their game, to understand the nuances. And it's a constant conversation. And for those of you who think that you can deal with it by shielding the children away from it, I don't think that's a good strategy, because they see, children are very observant, and it's better to explain that than to leave them in the confusion of that nuanced situation. Yeah. That's it. I don't see any other areas. I mean, I marked for myself several areas just because the whole thing is basically full of very important messages. We're talking about an apartheid system that arrests her while she is at home with her children, and leaves the children at the house without even knowing who's gonna care for them, right? So we're talking about, and this is for me, and again, yes, this is a fight for South Africans, but also this is a fight for Africans. When we talk about forgiving these people because it was their ancestors, they're still benefiting from the oppression their ancestors put on Africans. The oppression has not stopped. South Africa is still very much an apartheid-ish nation, right? South Africans are not liberated. You see these videos with Malema in court, and you have white men in African courts. What are white men doing in African courts if a country is liberated? What are white men doing in African courts? What are Boers doing in African courts if the country is liberated? So that's one thing we have to look at when we want to actually be liberated. We cannot have them in our systems of government. We cannot have them in the court system, because they're going to use their bias, their racism to judge us, because they will always see us as criminals, like we said. Because for as long as we are fighting the oppressor, they will always see us as criminals. So how can you have white people, white men especially, because it was a patriarchy system, judge you in your courts if you're a liberated African country? So I want to say asante, Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela, as we remember you today and honor you. Today would have been your 87th birthday. We thank you for these words. We thank you that you listened to your lawyer and wrote while you were in prison, because you give us insight into the enemy that we are fighting. You help us understand who they are, and you remind us that we must not forgive. We must demand repair, and we must demand our liberation. No forgiving, no compromise. I'm not saying kill, but I'm saying no forgiving and no forgetting. Because if we do, as she says here, she fears we're going to go backwards. And we cannot go backwards. I thank you all. Asanteni. Have a nice day. I'm just going to quickly look at the comments. There's no... Yes, indeed. Long live the legacy of Mama Winnie Madikizela-Mandela. And thank you all for stopping by.